Welcome to another episode of Inspired Voices. My name is Oliver Riera, and this is Diego Avilez. My man, how you doing?
Good, man.
Yeah.
Just happy to be here, you know.
Thanks for being on the show again, bro.
Dude, my pleasure.
Yeah.
Always a good conversation.
Right.
always a good time.
For those of you who don't know, Diego was on the podcast, season 2, episode 12. For those of you who want to watch it, I'll link the episode below. We talked a lot about your life. For the people who haven't watched, who people don't know you, why don't you kind of give us like a quick rundown of what you do?
What do? I am an artist by trade. I am a musician, pianist, composer, singer, and I am also the director at Oak City Music Collective. So we produce a lot of events and music series and programming in North Carolina. And I also direct the Incredible Talent Group, which is a talent agency representing artists from, Latin America, the U.S., and things of that sort. So I'm just kind of, artist, curator, producer,
kind of all things music, right?
Yeah, music at the center of my existence for sure.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So today's episode is going to be like the heartbeat of Latino music, getting down to the culture, the evolution, and the icons who really shaped it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you really can't, a lot of people think about, I feel like a lot of people think about when they think of salsa, they think of African roots because of the congas and all that stuff, right?
Sure.
But it's not just African roots. Why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of how that came about?
Yeah, salsa music, I think there's it's one of these things that fall into almost forgotten history in a way, and I think it's important to talk about, especially in nowadays, right? Like people, I think, exotify a lot of genres and especially in the States, compartmentalize a lot of different genres that come from folks from different parts of the world, right? Like if you go to Peru or like any Latin American country or the Caribbean, right? Like any Latin country, people listen to everything.
Yeah.
People are listening to salsa, to reggaeton, to reggae, to American Top 40, to funk. Like they listen to everything, and all these genres are mixed. There's not like salsa, listeners and bachata listeners and rock listeners. It's like it's very mixed.
Yeah.
I
never thought about that because in America it is kind of separated.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And I think it's a reflection of the culture. American culture is very segregated because of American history, right? So it's just like it tries to be like you're over here, you're over here, you're over here, you're over here. When we take salsa, this in the case of my band Tumbao, when we take our psychedelic salsa to different places, when we go to different cities, particularly like in places that aren't very hubs, like a lot of places in the South, down out west, Southwest per se, it's like, oh, salsa, like we should have a salsa night, and like that's great, love a good salsa night, but like also like, and you've been to Tumbao shows, like there's times where we have an indie rock band open up, and like it's a mixed genre, and like it's a completely different experience,
right?
And it's because to me that's very reflective of like how it is in the majority of the world. The majority of the world operates that way. It's the U.S. that really is interesting in that sense. So to talk about salsa, salsa really was one of America's first mainstream music. It was
coming from
New York.
From New York.
Right, like salsa is born in New York. And if you ask, if you put 10 Latin musicians in a room and ask them, hey, talk about the roots of salsa, everyone will tell you a different angle, right? Like, hey, it was this guy and you know, this guy and this group was doing it, and you know, I think like the point of agreement is that it was born in New York, as a fusion of a lot of things going on at the same time.
Okay.
You know, so it's like a lot of these things were going on at the same time. The evolution of music was happening at the same time. But yeah, like salsa is at its core American music.
That's
You know, like salsa is very much American, just like we are Latinos, but
Yeah.
we're still very much American in a
Right.
sense. You know, it's wild.
Right.
Yeah, it's a wild concept.
Going back to like, because it was born in New York, but before that, how did it come about?
So salsa really comes out of the reflection of like migration into a city like New York. You know, you have Spanish Harlem, right? You have Harlem with Black American music, jazz, and some of the greats of jazz, you know, really challenging the genre and innovating in their fields. And you have, you know, while that's going on, you know, you have all these different subgenres and things that were popular, like big band and, you know, the swing and that it started really mixing a lot of brass, you know, at major clubs in New York. And then you have this influx of Cuban immigrants in New York City that bring, you know, their sound, the son, el son cubano, and African rhythms, Afro-Cuban rhythms that came from Africa into Cuba, you know.
Mixed with the indigenous,
you know.
of America.
Right. You know, with the indigenous people of Cuba, you know, that come from the Tainos and all those groups of peoples. Those rhythms make it to New York.
Going back a little bit.
Yeah.
So before they even went to New York, you got that style of music mixed with African influence and Tainos and indigenous, right? So was that bomba? Or was bomba was more probably Puerto Rican, right?
Yes. Bomba is more Puerto Rican, en plena, and you have all these styles like bomba, plena, timba, you know, son, that really come from the resistance of people that came from Africa enslaved by colonizers and then were told not to play their music or their celebration or have their rituals.
Right.
And they were limited by, like, you know, Christian beliefs of that time, right? Like, because colonization was driven through Christianity, right? So,
right.
You know, they were like, you can't play this. And that's where you see a lot of the reshaping of these instruments. You know, like in Cuba, there's a great film that follows the Preservation Jazz Hall Band from New Orleans they travel to Cuba to talk about the roots of jazz in Cuba and like that exchange, right? Because New Orleans is the port, arguably the center of culture in the US, right? Like Creole culture, right? And it's also historically was the biggest port of enslaved peoples in the US, right? That's where like all our like the best food, like Creole, right? Which you find that throughout Latin America, Criollo, right?
So like you're saying, like it's the mixture of Latin America, Caribbean, European, everything is like right. That was like the root of where it was
in New Orleans.
Yeah.
Right. It was a massive port where like yes, like there was enslaved folks and there were, you know, the French, the Spanish, the natives, everything was there, and that's why the culture thrived, right? And that happens in a lot of places around Latin America, right? So in the United States, it manifested as the music that came from New Orleans, right? and the foods and all those things. And like, you know, prior to that, when people from Africa landed in Cuba and what is now Puerto Rico and all of these places, the Dominican Republic, the reshaping of the instruments that they had, you know, took place sometimes to be undercover.
Yeah.
You know, like in Cuba, like I was talking about, like the Preservation Jazz Hall, and that's a great movie. It's called A Tuba to Cuba. I recommend everybody should watch that that film. It's great. And you know, there's instruments of Afro-Cuban people that are chairs, and they're hollow. They built them as hollow, and you know, you would tap one side and it would make one tonality, and the other, you know, would be like dun 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 dun, and it was to hide the fact that they were playing music because they weren't allowed to. You know, at some point, the conga was, you know, like labeled as an instrument only to be used in Catholic practices. So there's like,
really,
yeah. So there's just like,
what? I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's like so much history around like the banning of instruments and like the innovation from those bands, right? To that really sparks all of these genres that we know to come from Latin America, right? Like cumbia comes from Africa, you know, people from Africa into Colombia, you know, mixing with the indigenous and bringing these styles of music and mixing with native instruments, what they had, you know.
When you talk about the mix of instruments and stuff like that, what instruments, do you know what kind of instruments the natives had in America versus the natives in Africa? Like people think about the congas, right?
Right.
They think that's African, right?
In a way, the conga comes as a fusion of African drums and materials found in Latin America, sometimes trying to recreate that or just make do with what was around.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? Like, because the drums, African drums, for example, and, you know, I can only speak to this as far as my knowledge of African drums go. There are some really great folks that have a lot of knowledge on this subject. Sure. You know, my buddy Atiba Rore is like a master of this from Africa Unplugged. Also a great project to check out, Africa Unplugged. They do a lot of this stuff. But, you know, these drums are built from materials around and the animal hides that were available, and they're connected to the land. You know what I'm saying? So I think in Latin America, you see a lot of this same concept with what was around.
Yeah.
Right. And then the musics, of course, there is definitely a difference, right? Like La Quena in South America from the Andes, from the indigenous people of the Andes, are these you know, tubes, you know, that were crafted from instruments there. La gaita, you know, this Colombian, you know, indigenous Colombian instrument that gets applied into cumbia, you know, so it just all starts mixing in Latin America.
Yeah.
You know, and all these genres pop up, right? These styles of music, you know, cumbia and in Peru, festejo and landó, and it just comes from the mix of everything. And where salsa comes is like a lot of these rhythms go into New York. And because New York being what it is, you know, that there was Cubans, there was Puerto Ricans, there was Dominicans, there was everybody from all over the world, and the fact of this representation of Latin rhythms, that's why it was called salsa, because it's a sauce, you know?
Yeah.
It has a little bit of everything, and that's why they called it salsa, you know?
Yeah.
And it originates from the jazz, you know, the Afro-Cuban, the Afro-Puerto Rican, the African rhythms, the brass that was going on in Harlem and in New York at that time, you know, so take all of those elements and you make a sauce. And that's what becomes salsa.
I like that.
You know, and people, a lot of people think that jazz musicians existed separately from salsa musicians. They were like, oh, you know, like, you know, all these folks are over here and the salsa folks were in the Bronx. And it's just like, no, like a lot of these folks played together, you know, like a lot of Latin jazz, right? It's like, existed at the same time as salsa, as the opener to salsa, right? Like salsa really comes from this starting of Latin jazz in a sense, and they were all working together and like really,
so like one person would play like a jazz temp or rhythm, and then like somebody from the salsa, or I guess from the from that style of music would play their style, and then that would create like a different genre.
Right,
like
right. And you have the introduction of, of the piano, right? And like European instruments, reed instruments and brass, and starts joining in on top of these African rhythms and these Afro-Cuban rhythms, and it becomes just a crazy mix of things, and
it's crazy how music genres come to be.
Yeah.
Because like, you got that reggaeton, bachata, and all these different types, and it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like kind of like what you said, where it's just different parts of the areas that created those genres.
What do you mean?
Like when you said cumbia, it comes from here, and then you travels to Mexico, and cumbia becomes something else, Mexican cumbia,
right?
Stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like it has to do with like a lot of like migration patterns, right? And like political things going on, and like customs and practices, right? Just like everything else, like cumbia really comes from the Caribbean shores of Colombia, and like the migration from Africa, through the slave trade into Colombia, and bringing these rhythms, mixes with the Colombian indigenous. Then that starts traveling through the Amazon, and like meets, indigenous Andean and closer like Peruvian. Like now, what is Peru? And like I always say, like, cumbia travels through the Amazon and takes a shot of, ayahuasca, and it becomes psychedelic cumbia, it becomes chicha. If you go to Peru, or cumbia is slightly different.
Yeah.
It's more psychedelic.
Interesting.
It's more guitar, psychedelic guitar bass, it's fast paced. Colombian cumbia is, a slightly different pace. They use, more of the indigenous flutes, the gaita, the accordions, things of that sort. The way that it travels into Mexico from there, a lot of people believe that it was through like DJs, a lot of DJs, and Mexican cumbia could be a little slower because apparently DJs had the ability to slow down those tracks.
Yeah.
And that really influenced the way that Mexican cumbia, is today, and of course there's, like I said, like there's when it comes to that, there's like a lot of theories and different, points of view on stuff like that.
Sure.
But that's a widely spoken about, how like Mexican cumbia came to be.
Yeah.
And it's all compounding. It all keeps adding, right? Like salsa created in New York, and then it starts going into different places. It travels back. It travels back home. It goes back to Cuba. It goes back to Puerto Rico. It goes to places like Colombia. It goes to places like Central America. It goes to places like Peru. And
then that changes.
And then that changes. And then those influences start, so now if you hear Peruvian salsa, if you hear Colombian salsa, is very like, you can be like, that's Colombian salsa. That's Venezuelan salsa. That's Cuban salsa. That's Puerto Rican salsa. I know, like, and then it travels back, and it's just like starts just evolving and evolving and evolving. Damn. Yeah. To the point that like, you hear, it's like it's
a never ending mix.
It's
right?
never ending. Yeah.
Dude, that's awesome. Man.
Yeah.
I love how that kind of comes to be. And then you can't talk about Latino music unless you're talking about like the celiacruzes, the Carlos Santana,
right.
I guess the people that, because celiacruz wasn't the first one to do salsa, right? But she is the first, correct me if I'm wrong, but might be the first one to take it mainstream in America.
So Celiacruz is, the queen of salsa, right? La reina de la salsa. And she, Cuban immigrant, really singing a lot of son cubano, and then really comes into the forefront of things through this group that forms at the inception of salsa in New York called the Fania All-Stars. And the Fania All Stars is this just massive ensemble of like exactly that, all stars. Héctor Lavoe, Willie Colon, Celiacruz, Cha Feliciano. Like it's just like all these masters just producing, and like this record label gets created, and these artists are just this group of artists is really taking salsa into the world, into the mainstream.
Yeah.
And that's where Celiacruz, starts coming up per se. She had been doing work for before that, even performing with a lot of jazz artists and stuff like that.
Right.
Into like being like, what is this? But with the Fania All Stars, that really pushed things forward.
Yeah. And then like you got like Bad Bunny's out. Bad Bunny's album is out right now.
Yeah.
And he's killing it with that album, man. It's
absolutely
like,
crushing it. Yeah.
As soon as I heard it, I was like, this motherfucker tapped into his roots hardcore.
Yeah.
And fucking nailed it. But like you can't just say it was a great album. You kind of have to dig deep, and it's because the storytelling within the music, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like I think he started that album, if I remember correctly, is because one of the comedians at the Trump rally was saying that it was a dumpster album.
Oh yeah,
like that,
yeah.
And he couldn't have that, so he kind of made this album. And the stories that they go, especially Latino music, go back to the roots of kind of like what you said when it was messages that the slaves would use to communicate and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And that you're still having that today in a modern way.
Right. Yeah, I mean, man, Bad Bunny is like, we knew he was revolutionary, and we, when he came out, with a very, Latin trap, Latin hip hop sound, reggaeton, fusion, dembow, into his own sound, into dominating world markets. I don't think there's a person that doesn't know who Bad Bunny is, know?
Right.
And he took it back to his roots. Like he was like, yo, what is from Puerto Rico, and like, I've been talking to a lot of Puerto Rican folks, and they're like, this album means so much to us. Like this, the references, not only the lyricism talking about what's going on in Puerto Rico in comparison to like Hawaii and like the colonization and the gentrification that's going out, and how people are getting pushed out of their homes, and how tax breaks are being given to U.S. born, like mainland born, U.S. born citizens to live in Puerto Rico, but not Puerto Ricans, and crypto haven and all these things. And for him to come out and come out with this album really shatters a lot of things, and it shakes things up, right? Because it's like, it proves exactly who we are as Latin people around the world. So it's like, you can't compartmentalize us. You can't put us in a box.
Right.
We do everything. Right. Bad Bunny has done everything. Bad Bunny has salsa songs on this album, and like everybody's listening to everything. So it's like, for artists like myself, that I struggle sometimes with booking in cities that aren't familiar with our culture, and they're like, oh, well, salsa, have a salsa night. It's just like Bad Bunny throws a curveball at that. Be like, Bad Bunny's doing salsa. It's like, we're not just a salsa band. We're Latin music. We're, it's music for everybody. Right. You know what I'm saying? We're not, it shakes things up, and that's what we should be doing as creatives. That's what we should be doing as artists. You know what I'm saying? Like, he has a 30-something date residency in Puerto Rico. Like, his shows this year are in his home country. The first couple of shows are for Puerto Ricans only, at prices that folks can afford. El Pueblo, you know what I'm saying? After that, opening up to like the rest of the world, I think it's about to generate $8 to $9 billion for the Puerto Rican economy. This artist alone, his concerts alone, and tourism and income for like, local businesses and things like that. So like, that's insane. Yeah. Like that's the power that artists have. Right.
And I feel like we forgot that a little bit, right? It got lost.
Yeah.
It was just like, creating music, it's just for fun and stuff like that. But what are you doing to change the world?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, I don't know, he started a revolution, man. And I think from that album coming out, I think other artists are going to be coming out even generations from now, looking back at that album,
Yeah.
and creating something crazy,
Yeah.
even more. Right?
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, like, and like that's the thing, right? Like, it's the beauty of fusion, and of not just putting people and cultures in a box, right? I mean, like, we talk about Celiacruz and Bad Bunny, and we talk, you know, in a way, like, these artists weren't that different, right? Like, Celiacruz is grabbing these genres and, you know, bending them with these genres, right? You know, it's people like Carlos Santana, right? Like, artists like Carlos Santana, like, innovators of Latin rock, of like, and like psychedelic Latin rock, right?
Yeah.
It's like, if you listen to, there's some, and by the way, like, there's some great, like, if you watch the history of Latin music on PBS, that's a great documentary. You know, the Fania released this movie called Our Thing by Fania, All Stars. And like, there's documentaries on Carlos Santana where he, you know, shares his story about how he grew up playing the guitar as a kid in brothels in like Southern California and like Tijuana too, you know. His dad would take him to like brothels and he would play as entertainment. And he would play guitar, and he grew up with Latin music being the mainstream. He grew up listening to salsa and son cubano and Afro-Cuban music, Afro-Puerto Rican music, because he was a kid at that time.
Yeah.
And, you know, 1960, early 60s, you see a shift of culture in the U.S. where, you know, the Cold War ends a lot of the migration, a lot of the Cuban migration to the U.S., and it's the same year that the Beatles arrive. So it's like, then rock and roll takes the forefront.
Right.
And you have this kid here that grew up in both worlds, plays guitar, grew up listening to mainstream Latin music, and then is experiencing the Beatles. 10 years forward, he's introducing Latin rock and like psychedelic Latin music to the world at Woodstock.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, just grabbing these genres and bending them, you know, and like, I mean,
Thinking outside the box and everything.
Yeah.
I think as artists, that's like the number one important thing, is thinking outside the box when creating music and stuff like that. Especially when it comes to like the lyrics that are said and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
You know, protesting what society, the community, what's going on in the community.
Yeah.
And breaking the rules that are formed in your little box in order to improve the world.
Right.
Kind of thing.
So. Yeah. I mean, like, you know, we have a lot of power as creatives, and I think, you know, things like charts and like, you know, like Billboard charts and Spotify streams and all these industries are really exploiting artists. You know, they make artists forget the power that we have, and like the power that, you know, the ability that we have to really impact our communities through our art.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
for sure.
Bad Bunny has impacted the whole world, and like, you know, this is for his community, for his country, you know, like that's so powerful. And
doing that, focusing on that, made him the number one artist in the world.
Insane. Who knew?
Yeah, exactly. Dude, thank you for, I think this is a very important talk. I think not a lot of people know about this, and the type of influence that Latin music has, especially.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you having on, talking about it and stuff like that.
Yeah, of course.
If you found this helpful, comment below. If you want to add on to this conversation, comment below. Let's have a discussion down below and see if we can, you know, make the world a better place. You know, send this video to somebody who you think it would be inspired to kind of go down the route of creating some type of changing music that will change the world. So, do you want to tell everybody where they can find you and all that?
Yeah, you know, speaking of Latin music, definitely check out my Latin band. It's called Tumbao. Instagram, Tumbao Band, tumbaoband.com. We are a project that's also bending the rules and, you know, presenting Latin rooted music through our American experience, not only in the States, but, internationally now. So definitely go. We just dropped a new album a few weeks ago, so go listen to that, pump it up, and
What's it
keep up
called?
with us. It's Luna. Our new
Nah.
album is Luna. Dropped anywhere you listen to music. So yeah, check it out. Tumbao. Yeah, link up with, if you're in North Carolina, link up with Oak City Music. Always trying to plug in different artists from not only here in the States, but we're working on bringing international artists so people can really experience music scenes that, are beyond what is presented here.
Right.
So.
Right. So you got Tumbao. Talk to me about why you formed Tumbao in the first place.
So Tumbao is a reflection of my experience here in the States, or just it's a reflection of my experience as a young immigrant to this country from Peru, coming from one of the meccas of salsa, moving to New York at a tender age, of like 8, where so many genres came about, learning how to play music over there, absorbing all these genres of Black American music, jazz, R&B, soul, hip hop, with my own roots of Latin music, salsa, Afro-Peruvian music, cumbia, rock and roll, Latin rock. And that's kind of where Tumbao takes place. It started out with close friends that really played in so many vast different genres, punk music and jazz and indie rock, and this fusion really came about based on Afro-Cuban rhythms and salsa that just became very psychedelic and very danceable and very high energy. And
yeah, did you keep that in mind when you formed the band? Like, you wanted people from different kinds of worlds and genres that they played and stuff like that? Like, were you conscious about it?
I think that, naturally, my circle has always been very diverse. So like, it happened very naturally, very organically,
Yeah.
So yeah, next thing we have this group, and these other friends are like in other projects that, we're playing some psychedelic salsa, and then we're going to see another one of our bandmates' other projects that plays punk rock, and it's just like, but that's what being American is, right? It's like, it's so vast,
right?
So.
Right.
So yeah.
So talk to me about like the type of music that Tumbao does play.
We play. Some people call it. I think the best, most encapsulated term would be psychedelic Latin music.
Okay.
A lot of folks call it psychedelic salsa. Some people call it psychedelic Latin jazz. I've heard people call it electric salsa. And it's just like, we're a 10-piece band with, 4 horns, trombone, alto, tenor sax, trumpet. You have, 2, piano, synthesizers, bass, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, full drum set, congas, auxiliary percussion. It's just an immense wall of sound,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really like, when we started the band, our main focus, and it continues to be, to really push genres forward, like break barriers. And, at a Tumbao show, you'll find everybody and anybody, I'm talking about like people from every intersection, and it's beautiful. It's great. And to see people dancing and moving whichever way they know how to and they can, and to see people that are really into salsa be able to fully dance salsa, and people are, it's people crowd surfing, and it's insane.
Yeah, man. I like that, because like you said, it's a mix, and then you have people at your shows that maybe don't know much about salsa.
Right.
But you introduce them to it.
Yeah.
Especially when there's other bands in there that are different genres, right?
Yeah.
Because their audience is there too. And so you just like expand that way, man.
Yeah.
I think you guys are doing a good job.
Thanks, man. Yeah, it's, I always joke that a lot of the things that I hear from new people that never seen tumbao, they're like, wow, I didn't know I liked Latin music. Like, you know, it's just like, yeah.
Yeah.
You know?
Especially when you can hear it live, man. That makes a whole new difference right there.
Yeah. Oh yeah. For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. You know, and like that's the thing. Like that's where that lost history comes into place. Right? It's just like, dang. Like I wish people knew that Latin music was like one of America's first mainstream music.
Yeah.
You know.
For sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, man.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
This is Inspired Voices. I'm Oliver Riera, and this is Diego Avilez.